We hand over to the next panel, the Advocacy Plenary Session on enabling effective international enforcement cooperation through advocacy. And please, after this panel, don't leave, because we still have a little award ceremony that we have every year in the ICN, the Competition Advocacy Contest Awards ceremony, and it's much more fun for those who receive an award if they're still applauded by those who are still in the room. So please stay in the room for some minutes after this panel. Having said that, I hand over to the Advocacy Working Group for their panel. Please, you have the floor. The stage is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're the only ones standing in the way between dinner and that excellent award ceremony that Andreas referred to, so we'll try to be effective with the use of our time. During the past 2 days, we've talked about international cooperation and effective enforcement. And always we were looking at modalities by which we could achieve that. We in the Advocacy Working Group have been looking at whether there's a role for advocacy in terms of optimizing that international cooperation for purposes of effective enforcement. And we thought that as part of this afternoon's session, we would draw on the experiences and the insights of various national competition agencies with regard to their use of advocacy as a tool to further international cooperation. Of course, there are situations where a lot of programs are still in the pipeline and they have not been properly implemented yet, and we will touch on these as well. This dovetails into our efforts into trying to develop guidelines as part of the work program of the Advocacy Working Group. These guidelines will set out some modalities, some suggested good practices, drawing on the good experience of countries which have indeed used advocacy as a tool to further international cooperation in enforcement. So we have gathered here an outstanding group of competition officials who will talk about their perspectives from this important advocacy perspective. First, we have Andrés Barreto, the Superintendent of the Superintendencia de Industria y Comercio of Colombia, Mr. Francis Kariuki, the Director General of the Kenyan Competition Authority, Ioannis Lianos, President of the Hellenic Competition Commission, Olha Pishchanska, the Chairperson of the Antimonopoly Committee of Ukraine, and of course, to initiate our discussion on the basis of the joint OECD ICN report on international cooperation, Antonio Gomes, the Deputy Director for Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD. Antonio, just to get things started, the OECD, of course, has prepared this joint report together with the ICN on international cooperation in competition enforcement. Among the key findings are that there are still limitations and challenges which countries face when trying to enhance cooperation in this field. Do you see advocacy as being a tool or a necessary complement to these efforts to try to enhance international cooperation for enforcement activities? And could you take us quickly through what you have seen in your report and what you see as possible paths forward in order to implement these?
Thank you so much, Ioannis, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate Andreas, Mundt, Bundeskartellamt, the ICN for such a wonderful event, and it's so good to be here in person in Berlin. I think that the case for international cooperation is stronger today than it has ever been. We have globalization, we have increased concentration, and especially we have increased digitalization of our economy that is often or mostly cross-border. And I think that this really strengthens the importance of international cooperation. But as you were saying, there are still some hurdles, still some challenges. So what is the state of play of international enforcement cooperation. And I wanted to highlight two reports. You mentioned one, which is a report that was done jointly with the ICN from 2021, and another report from the OECD this year on the monitoring of the implementation of our 2014 recommendation on international cooperation. And what are the main findings of those reports? And of course, the findings are quite coincident there. So the good news is that, and this is from the survey of OECD and ICN members, so international cooperation is widespread and is active. So those are the good news. However, outside regional cooperation agreements, such as the ICN or the Nordic Agreement or Australia and New Zealand, cooperation is mostly limited to informal cooperation and exchanges. And normally it's between the same set of jurisdictions. We see that exchange of confidential information almost occurs only via waivers, and there is very little use of next generation mechanisms such as gateways. And outside regional agreements, there is hardly any investigative assistance between agencies. And if we think of other enhanced forms of cooperation, these are still not taking place. There haven't been really developments since 2012. So one of the main explanations for this reality is the legal barriers. There are various, and a lot of these have been identified in the report, the joint report of OECD-ICN, but one of the main one is still the legal barriers for exchange of confidential information and for investigative assistance. And so one of the areas where we can go further is trying to start seeing how can we tackle those legal barriers. So your question, what is the role of advocacy here? And I want to highlight three target groups that we can have in mind when thinking about advocacy. One is governments, of course, because there's a lot that we cannot do on our own, and we need to engage governments. The second, I would say, is agency staff, advocacy, internal advocacy to agency staff. And finally, advocacy to business. So, advocacy to governments, let's start there. Agencies on their own cannot overcome the legal obstacles that we have for enforcement cooperation. And we will be discussing at the OECD in June ways to try to overcome those obstacles. And one of the ways, and again, we were looking in the previous panel that actually was one of the last remarks, was we should look at other fields and see how other areas of regulation are tackling certain issues. So why don't we look at other fields, other enforcement areas like taxation, like financial securities, like anti-corruption, and see if there is anything there that could be helpful for the competition area. But of course, if there are solutions to be implemented, we need governments on board. So we need to have advocacy for governments so that they understand the need for more and better international cooperation, what are the benefits of that cooperation. And I think that OECD and ICN work products can help providing a narrative and provide good case studies of successful examples from different jurisdictions. And I want to highlight, and this is not a sales speech, but to say that the OECD has prepared a short note on the experiences in other policy areas, which is now available online. So governments need to know what tools do we still need, and do we need other types of bilateral or multilateral agreements to tackle this. Advocacy to agency staff is quite important, and I'm sure that the heads of agency here in this room, they are all well behind strengthening cooperation, and they actually stimulate cooperation. But sometimes case handlers, when they're dealing with complex and very difficult cases, perhaps cooperation is not their priority. And of course, we know that one of the obstacles to cooperation often is also the question of resources, of time, etc., etc. So it's important that there is advocacy to staff to make them fully aware of what are the opportunities and benefits of international cooperation so that they know what are the mechanisms and the legal frameworks that they have to use for international cooperation, and design mechanisms that are easy and that they are safe, that they can use to notify other agencies about a case or about planning investigations, for example, future dawn rates, etc., etc. So again, I think OECD and ICN can have an important role here to develop best practices for agency staff and promoting network opportunities, which is what we do with workshops, etc. Advocacy to business is also quite important, and especially whilst we still do not have the legal tools to go beyond what we have now and actually have exchange of confidential information without the waivers. So we still need the business community, and it's very important that we keep insisting and explaining to business that there are benefits to business of cooperating and providing those waivers. The advance in terms of speed and costs savings, avoid duplicative information requests, aligning theories of harm, aligning outcomes, etc. I want to give a final word on ongoing work that involves the OECD and the ICN, and this is the OECD Competition Enforcement Cooperation Database. And we've sent a survey to OECD and to ICN members, and I do hope that you will respond to this survey. And the idea is to have really a always updated database on the legal basis for cooperation, on the safeguards for cooperation, on the instruments for cooperation, to actually make cooperation a lot easier. And this is really another good example of the excellent partnership between the ICN and the OECD. And I think that together, and it's not only ICN and OECD, we can think of other international organizations and also the bilateral and multilateral relationship between the agencies. This is really what will take us further in terms of international cooperation.
Excellent, Antonio. Thank you. And I think that reference to competition enforcement cooperation database is something that can feed into the work program of the advocacy working group in developing those set of guidelines. I did want to get back on some aspect of your advocacy targeted at governments, but prior to that, I'll invite our colleagues to weigh in first on their own perspective on this issue. Andrés, Colombia is known to have taken a focus on bilateral approaches towards increasing cooperation. How have you incorporated advocacy as part of that approach?
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, we do think that working through an international cooperation that, although is not non-binding, we have the means in order to flexibilize that kind of cooperation between those memorandums of understanding, but furthermore, the real sense of authorities of the need to work together. From time to time when we open investigations or we're making market studies or we're issuing a document, we see that other authorities reach out for us in order to try to share some information, of course, not legal or proper judicial information, but many things that can help them in cases that they have without us breaching any international commitment or any due process law in order to try to exchange information. For now, Colombia has 11 memorandums of understanding with different authorities in different levels, but we're also out in the cross line of many things. For instance, we're a part of our regional organization, the Andean Community. We have recently been introduced to the OECD as a formal member of the organization, and of course, we do believe very much in the cooperation that we carry on through the networks such as ICN and the other networks that we work in. Colombia, as many of the Latin American countries, has a very rigid perspective about international law and international cooperation, but I do think that working through the networks and working through with many of our colleagues has given us a new line of thought about this. We can, of course, embrace due process and carry on our investigations without breaching any type of confidential information, but we do think that strengthening cooperation, because many of our cases are at least regional or worldwide, it will be very, very interesting and important for us to share that experience, regardless of the regime that we have in any of our jurisdictions. The second issue is that advocacy has proven to be a very effective tool, because through advocacy, we have tried to tackle many of the competition issues and problems, and we have found, at least in Colombia, that the best way to shape policy on competition is through advocacy. Better than regulation, better than going into courts, even better than imposing the sanctions. So advocacy has proven to be a very effective tool. And we try to work with Philippines and many of our colleagues in the Working Party in order to enhance those tools, enhance that knowledge, and of course try to cooperate among our countries, among the network, and of course trying to push forward that cooperation between our colleagues in the Andean community, our colleagues in the Latin American region, if you might, and understand that it's not a discussion between East and West or formal international law or flexible law, but that a reality is important in order to enforce proper competition, shaping competition policy, and of course the experience that we have gained inside our jurisdictions, it has proven to be very useful to many other agencies, but I do think that to competition as well. We don't want to get into the debate about which jurisdiction or which legal system is the best. As Professor Kovacic was saying, I think any approach is good as long as you can use it properly, and I do think what we do in the ICN and the joint work with the Oecd, and of course what we're trying to do with our colleagues in the Andean community, that I do hope that can gain more traction here in the ICN and other networks, will prove that advocacy as compliance, it's a very effective way of cooperation, and it's a very effective tool for competition, not only enforcement, but policy.
That's excellent, Andrés. Thank you. I was taking note, 11 MOUs. In the Philippines, in the last 6 years, we've only been able to have 3, and that took a real huge effort on our part. So 11 MOUs is really quite impressive. And also, of course, that recent membership into OECD is aspirational for a lot of countries, including my own. The last point I just wanted to raise is that I think we will find out that there's a lot of resonance in terms of bilateral and regional approaches that have been taken in using advocacy as a tool for mainstreaming competition policy and law. And I think, Francis, you will have something to say on that as well. In your experience in the East Asian community, you were talking at the margins of this conference about your experience in COMESA, and I thought you might want to talk about how you have used the platform of trade negotiations of economic partnership agreements as a vehicle for including advocacy as part of the tools to enhance international cooperation for enforcement activities. Can you shed a little bit more light on that, please?
Thank you, Johannes. And I'll not be conclusive to say that working with the cooperation agencies within the negotiations of trade agreements has been successful, but I would like to share with the plenary in regard to my key observations in this area, so that the plenary can decide whether it has been successful or not. And starting is that I would like to share with the plenary that Kenya is a member of 2 regional economic communities. One is the East African community, where 40% of the membership have competition agencies. And then we have COMESA, where around 65% of the member states have competition agencies. Why am I giving these statistics? The negotiations for assenting of this treaty have been through my life in the competition world. And I realized that where the percentage of membership is higher, where there are competition agencies, and they are involved in negotiations, the quality and the effectiveness of the protocols produced from there, they become more effective in terms of enhancing regional trade. East African community negotiations took about 4 or 5 years. came up with a common competition policy and regulations, which were promulgated in 2006, and up to now is that the institution has been formed, but it has not been populated. And you can see within the East African community, we are still having some kind of regulations, national regulations, which are affecting cross-border trade, negating the objective of the East African community. For example, a vehicle, or rather a haulage transport company transporting some goods from Tanzania, when it arrives at the border post of Kenya, it's supposed to offload to a Kenyan trucker who moved towards Nairobi. That kind of restraint obviously affects the regional integration. And the key thing is because we don't have a functioning competition agency within the East African community. In regard to COMESA, where we have over 65% of the members having competition agencies, the negotiations took shorter time, although the output was not as effective as I would have expected, because one is that they came up with merger filing fees, which were not very conducive for small, medium enterprises. They were supposed to pay about $450,000 for a merger application, which I think it's higher than even my pension when I'll be leaving my service. But through our intervention and with the support of our development partners like World Bank, we were able to advocate for reducing the merger filing fees, and COMESA was appreciative. We also worked with the COMESA in terms of also bringing subsidiary legislation, which is more supportive of this regional integration. But now, and COMESA within a very short time is that it has been able to populate its organization and has started enforcement, although it's just through mergers, starting with mergers, and then now it's moving to enforcement of cartels. So in short, where we have credible competition agencies, we are seeing much easier negotiations. And now to mention the ongoing African Continental Free Trade Area negotiations. Under the informal platforms, like the African Competition Forum, is that we were able to build a critical mass of competition agencies. And luckily enough, they have been included in the negotiations. And right now, we have a draft protocol on competition policy within less than a year. I don't know the contents yet, but I've been briefed that we have a draft competition policy within a year. So in short, what I'm saying is that even informal platforms for competition agencies are able to build that critical mass and harmonization of thoughts before the real competition, before the real negotiations. The other area I see is where, and I need protection from the chair, who I know was a trade expert and was a key negotiator in some of the areas. If you give the trade experts the sole role of pushing for negotiations, it's difficult to move forward because they are always inward looking. And they always protect their own, even what they don't have. For example, there was an issue in Kenya where a company invested in clinker production, and then there was cheaper clinker coming from Egypt, and then the company was saying the National Treasury, with the support of the Ministry of Trade, should increase the import duty of clinker so that we consume ours, and yet the one which was the ours was more expensive than the one from Egypt. But through our intervention is we were able to convince and advocate for maintenance of that import duty, and we have seen the prices of cement have remained constant, even during construction boom in Kenya. So that has been our experience with other competition agencies in trade negotiations.
Very good. Excellent, Francis. Certainly a lot of the narratives that you have shared with us also resonate across the other side of the world. For instance, in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia, we were talking about every time there's an increase in prices, there's an allegation for cartel, and the Philippine Competition Commission is not doing its job. And the same thing happens across borders when, Southeast Asia also suffers through such increases in prices of food commodities. Everyone else in ASEAN competition authorities say that we're all sleeping on the job. So I'm glad to see that, for instance, in your example, you were able to ensure that for the importation of clinker and for the downward impact on prices of cement, you were able to ensure that some sufficient remedy was attained through your timely intervention. Ioannis, Greece has engaged with the European Consumers Association and other non-government associations for purposes of mainstreaming competition law and policy. And it is seen as an effective tool in terms of using advocacy in its various guises as a means to ensure that the consumers are activated, they're made more proactive in terms of raising competition concerns where they are perceiving it. And also, this is something which is not limited to the territory of Greece, but because of your pan-European activities, it has gained support and a proactive initiative on other European citizens as well to start raising complaints regarding competition issues where they see it. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, as well as your other initiatives with other non-government associations in line with mainstreaming advocacy as a tool to further enforcement activities?
Sure, thank you very much, Johannes. I definitely think that advocacy is something that should be broader than the usual crowd of governments and businesses. Obviously extremely important, but I think is also to build a broader alliance for competition in the civil society. I think this is crucial in order to ensure the effectiveness of our work as competition authorities and also our independence, which I think is quite important as well. So from this perspective, we need, I think, to engage with a number of stakeholders. And obviously the most obvious stakeholder we need to engage with are consumers. So from this perspective, we have organized in collaboration with BEUC, which is a European Consumer Association, a cooperation with them with regards to the training of consumer associations, not only in Greece, but also more broadly. So we launched a training session, two actually training sessions. One we organized together with the Cyprus Competition Authority, and another one with a number of colleagues from competition authorities in Europe that came and shared their experiences with consumer associations. And I think this is extremely important and has been quite successful so far. We'll love to continue our cooperation with BEUC. But I think consumers are not the only stakeholders we need to engage with. In our own work, we have tried to open up to different categories of citizens. For instance, in the context of the European discussions about collective bargaining for freelancers, we have tried to engage with trade unions and unions representing freelancers in order to first get an idea about the situation in the market, their views, in order to somehow help us frame our position, also with regards to the European Commission's initiatives. We did the same with small and medium firms. I think it's extremely important to develop tools to educate small and medium firms and associate their associations and their unions in competition law and policy. We have actually done the same as well in our specific work concerning privacy, with privacy groups, as well as in the context of the sustainability initiative with ecological groups and groups that are somehow promoting the green economy. So I think this is extremely important for competition authorities to engage with these groups. And I think in the context of a smaller agency, where also the market for expertise is generally small. I mean, we're not in the United States where you can have actually amazing experts in economics or different areas quite easily. We need to build bridges with research institutions and universities. I think this is extremely important. This helps us somehow to develop evidence-based policymaking in the area. So we have developed, in the context of the last 2 years, a number of university partnerships. First, actually, we have actually our data science program. So we collaborate with a data science institution, the University of Athens. We also actually have developed a program with a university, the Aegean, in order to build a consumer app for harvesting prices, for instance, price information in the maritime routes and commercial routes in the Greek islands, which is, I think, quite interesting for us. In the energy sector, we're working with University of Economics in Athens, but also Cambridge University, the energy group. And we have also developed some advocacy type of initiatives. For instance, we launched a competition art competition to engage a bit of the broader public, as well as we engaged a special group, the marketing department of the Athens Economics University to develop our campaign basically for competition advocacy. And recently we have done a legal clinic with the Erasmus University of Rotterdam concerning one of our cases. So I think that's extremely important for competition authorities to reach out to a wider group of citizens in society, actually, than consumers only.
Well, that certainly augurs well for having a broader base of information and analysis when you are going to engage in enforcement activities which affect not only Greek, but also other nationalities within the European Union. Now, if I may turn to Olha, and I have to just say that it is a real privilege to have you join our panel, notwithstanding all the difficulties that your country faces. So we are really grateful for your effort in making time for this. One thing that perhaps could be asked, and maybe we could ask you to focus on, is with the current emergency situation in Ukraine, how do you maintain competition principles as part of the mainstream in government policy making, if at all? Or if it is going to be something which has to be mitigated as a way to make sure that businesses are spurred in the short term, how do you ensure that it will not result in long-term harm to markets? How do you make competition principles relevant in this age? And are there plans already afoot for the kind of measures that would allow for competition to recover in a post-war scenario? Perhaps you could address these questions, Olha.
Greetings. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. It's very important for us, and I'm glad to be here with you and to feel your support. Ukraine has been repelling Russian military attacks for 7 days, and you know this. Our infrastructure and economy are collapsing. ICN was one of the first to react to the war and suspended the participation of Russia. We are grateful for that. Now we are witnessing a huge geopolitical crisis that has become the result of monopolies and that now escalated into energy and political blackmail. Recently, a German government official said that Russia was bombing Ukraine's grain infrastructure to reduce competition. And this is totally true. It is also blocking our sea routes, ports, roads, and railways, destroyed energy infrastructure to push Ukraine out of the world economy. to offer its partnership instead of the Ukrainian one. It's absolutely new and very hard problem for Ukraine, but Ukraine is absolutely sure of its victory. Indeed, it was destroyed the part of our economy, and this destruction continues of this day. So after the victory, we will have to redefine new economic realities and to reevaluate the state of our business and preparing a new plans for rebuilding our country, our economy. But history knows examples when, for the sake of rapid economic recovery, the government turned a blind eye to the establishment of trust and the formation of monopolies. Huge sums of public funds were pumped only into certain industry. For some time, all this contributed to economic growth. But later, the government of this country had to apply hard methods of response to correct the imbalance in the economy. It is very important for Ukraine to avoid such mistakes at the start of post-war reconstruction. At the moment, our government is working to liberalize business rules and make it easier for undertakings to go through a difficult war period. A lot of business representatives appreciate this support and even pay taxes in advance. Now we believe that the post-war economic policy should be based on such major steps as synchronization of Ukrainian markets with the markets of the European Union, which is consistent with our global goal. Ukrainian associate membership with further accession to the EU. Full membership in Oecd Competition Committee. This organization is planning to open a regional office in Kyiv soon, which is a good sign for us. Formation of an effective equities market. Introduction of stimulation initiatives for domestic and external investors. Ensures 11 planning field for business to gain access to investment. The MKO will take an active part in this process of monitoring, distribution, and effective use of funds coming to Ukraine from international donors. The main tasks of MKO for 2-3 years of the post-war period will be full analysis of state of competition in post-war markets, because now we have big problem with our businessmen, who's closed all, who's must leave our fabrics, our plants, and we must complete an analysis after war. Analysis of extending barriers to entry, development of effective mechanism for cooperation with EU competition authorities in terms of joint investigation of violation, elimination of barriers for exchange of information. And in doing so, we will need help and cooperation from our international colleagues. The war does not cancel our obligation to the world community to implement competition law reform. And the post-war period will require even stricter and fairer supervision of competition. Throughout the exchange of experience with our partners from ICN, OECD, USAID, and EU Twinning project, we have already reached the final stage of the first phase of competition reform and have begun to prepare for the start of the second phase. I would like to thank our colleagues from Lithuania, Switzerland, USA, Great Britain, Mexico, Poland, Romania, and many others for their support and experience. They helped us redefine our competition legislation. Together with our partners, we are building a new philosophy of relation between competition authorities, the business community and the public. The life is blown to win. Ukrainian will be victorious. Thus, let this victory to be out. Come on. I do believe in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Olha. I think your message is really heartfelt, and even for competition authorities and officials who have a narrower, shall we say, mandate in the way that we craft our rules, I think that you could already sense the kind of support, not only for your overall objectives, but also for the kind of commitment you still espouse for competition law and principles, not only during these times, but in a post-war scenario. So I think you could count on the support of the international community, even in this specific field that we are involved in. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope thank you.
There was something which I indicated to you, Antonio, that I had wanted to get back to, and this is with regard to the advocacy towards government agencies. It seemed to me that a qualitative change in enforcement cooperation may require changes in domestic laws that do not necessarily allow free exchange of confidential information, for instance, and evidence, possibly the lack of binding agreements between jurisdictions. From a young competition agency perspective like the Philippines, and I'm sure this is something which can also be applied by others, what would be a convincing narrative to governments to convince them that it would be inevitable to have the government involved in the kind of changes which are necessary to effectively conduct international enforcement activities? How would you go about convincing a government which probably is very defensive about the kind of laws it already has in place or the kind of rules that it has on the ground, and sort of refuses to budge in terms of making these qualitative changes that you referred to?
Ioannis, allow me first, and because, as you said, I think that we all feel what Olha has said, and also I wanted to here express my support, but also the OECD support to Ukraine in the current difficult, devastating situation, but also, as you also mentioned, in the post-war situation, and the OECD is, as Olha mentioned, opening an office in Kiev, and again, I think everyone here feels exactly the same. So going back to governments, and governments, how can we convince governments that indeed it might be a good thing to change their domestic legislation to allow, for example, for the exchange of confidential information or investigative assistance? I don't think that I will be giving that answer here today, and that's certainly the work for the ICN Advocacy Working Group. But I can give some hints, and I think that we're actually at the right moment in time to actually have this discussion with governments. Because I think that governments, and I see that in the discussions at the G7 level, but in many other countries, I think that governments are concerned about some of the challenges that globalization is posing. I think that they are concerned about the fact that we have multinational companies active across jurisdictions with similar business models, and sometimes they may be eventually abusing their dominant position, or there may be cartels that are really across borders, and we see more and more of that, or mergers that are affecting multiple jurisdictions. And as I said at the beginning, digitalization has really put a spotlight on all of this. And I think that governments are more and more aware that different competition authorities are trying to tackle this issue sometimes on their own. And they're also trying to find regulatory solutions themselves, sometimes within regional areas. But they're addressing very similar or sometimes the same kind of behaviors. And I think that governments are also concerned about increased concentration and the fact that there might be abuses of market power there. So I think that this is the moment where governments can understand why having more enhanced or strengthened international cooperation can be useful. And they need to also understand that it can only be done if competition authorities do have the right tools to actually cooperate in an effective manner. And again, as I said before, I think that pointing to other areas that have been already so successful can be a way of opening their minds to also perhaps considering this type of solutions in the competition area. Again, there's a lot more to explore, and I would really look forward to the work that the ICN Advocacy Working Group will be doing on this, and I'm sure the OECD will try to contribute to the discussion as well.
Thank you, Antonio. In fact, one approach that we had in mind was not only to look at the success stories where advocacy for international cooperation in enforcement activities were undertaken, but also in certain situations where if advocacy were part of the sandbox of tools that were used, could a different outcome have been obtained instead of something which perhaps failed to resolve a particular case or controversy. Maybe if you had more support, if you had been advocating actively to gain support from other stakeholders, ordinary people, or consumer associations, for instance, as Ioannis had alluded to.
That was an excellent point by Johannes, and indeed, we cannot just look at advocacy from the, I was simplifying the world, but indeed, if you want support even for the advocacy to governments, you need to have other stakeholders behind you, and civil society is really quite important to not forget.
Exactly, especially for, again, competition agencies which are still trying to mainstream competition law into the consciousness of ordinary people. You would want them to be activated and be more proactive in lending support to initiatives on enforcement. So I think that's an excellent point that you made. And again, we're hoping that we could draw on the contribution of OECD as we develop this set of guidelines that I had referred to as part of the work program of the Advocacy Committee. Andrés, let me turn to you again. You had mentioned earlier the role of bilateral approaches and extending this even to regional approaches within the Andean community. Typically in some countries, when you engage in these kinds of negotiations, there's a need for support from other stakeholders, from business groups, civil society, academia, in terms of trying to obtain that kind of critical mass that would allow you to facilitate the conclusion of these bilateral approaches or these regional trade agreements, especially with new issues like competition being part of the mix. How do you advocate? What kind of unilateral initiatives have you undertaken to gain that kind of support? Just not only for the conclusion of these bilateral approaches and regional trade agreements, but to highlight the importance of competition principles, i.e. cooperation mechanisms that would allow you to pursue enforcement in the future if necessary?
Well, I do think that we have separate discussions there in the Andean community or in South America, if you might. One is that, of course, we all believe in the same competition policy, but unfortunately, from time to time, politics get into the mix of competition policy, and what we don't like is competition politics. So we do think that we, in the end, uphold the same legal background about what competition is about, economically and legally speaking. Unfortunately, we do think that a more effective discussion will be if many stakeholders, like the example, for instance, Greece was bringing, the fact that many NGOs or many collectives or other actors, the non-state actors might act in favor of this. So regarding competition, I do think that we have a critical mass that, of course, understands from academia, the business, and the legal perspective, the legal practice perspective, that the need to shape and competition policy in the region is a must. We do have a regional decision. The way the Andean community works is very similar to what the UE does. Of course, it's a supranational agreement. It's binding to all the countries, but we're countries that have a different level of maturity concerning competition. So we do think that to be backed up in our countries by several stakeholders is very important in order to shape in that cooperation, and of course, to in the end be, of course, effective in the fact that we can modify our laws, even if they're regional or even if they're our domestic laws. So we do think that the work that academia, that NGOs, and that of course our own governments do, it's very important, because although we believe in the same substance of what competition is, we do think that from time to time politics badly carried away in competition, or politics as a mean of making competition, as you were stating, for instance, in this shortage, inflation, and many other issues, harms this. So we do think that working with academia, working with other stakeholders, and working together among the competition authorities more than our governments is very effective in this kind of approach. But of course, legal practice, academia, and institutions are like the key holistic view that you might need in order for this to be victorious.
That's really something to latch on to in terms of a holistic approach towards getting the kind of support and advocacy going for competition principles, including when the time comes to enforce against certain cartels or certain abusive behavior. I was struck also by your reference to perhaps using that base of the academe and other non-state actors for purposes of getting critical mass to support competition. Because I think that's something I would tie up with what Francis said earlier in terms of trade negotiations and as a vehicle for getting competition principles embedded in international treaties between regional partners. And I was struck because, Francis, you referred to how sometimes if you leave trade negotiations in the leadership, in the hands of trade negotiators themselves, new issues like competition would fall off because there's the tendency to have defensive approaches when it comes to such new issues. How have you overcome that challenge as part of your efforts to build advocacy in competition?
Thank you, Johannes. And let me start by indicating that international advocacy can only succeed with or after successful, credible national advocacy initiatives. As a competition agency, you have to build credibility within your borders so that at least the other government agencies can listen to you when you are pushing for an agenda for international advocacy cooperation. And when we started as Competition Authority of Kenya, is that we started with what we call soft enforcement. And soft enforcement was pushing for removal of regulatory obstacles within Kenya. And with that, is that we were able to be invited in the table. And when we're in that table now, we could be able to push for international advocacy. For example, when COMESA, Competition Commission, came into being, is that I was supposed to cede some of the powers donated to us by our parliament. But the process of ceding that power could have been very difficult. I couldn't have gone to my parliament and tell them that COMESA has come on board, is that I would like to give them this power in terms of merger regulation. So even the detail of drafting those changes is very critical, because we approached Parliament and told them that we would like to be given powers to be exempting some of the mergers through regulations. And when you exempt then through regulations, is that we are saying we will be referring these mergers to COMESA. And having built a credible advocacy initiative within the country, the national government and parliamentarians could accept what we are saying. The other area is, Antonio here highlighted advocacy to stakeholders, government, internal stakeholders, and also firms. But also I'd like to add that there's need of advocating even to the members of the press, so that if at all there are other regulatory obstacles affecting international cooperation, the press can appreciate and highlight it to the policymakers. Sometimes it's good to use them as infantry, because as a competition agency, there are some words we can't use, but the press can use. Then the other area I've seen through my experience is that there's need for cooperation and harmonization of agency strategic goals across the region you're cooperating. Because I wouldn't be comfortable utilizing my resources and have not prioritized this area of cooperation. So when we are developing our strategic plan, there's need of sitting down and the work plans and agree this is the area we would like to push our resources towards, and obviously highlighting the impact so that we can be showing the impact assessment. And also in terms of the trade experts, what we have done is that when we are negotiating for protocols for goods and services, is that we have been combining them with the competition policy protocols. And with that is that competition agency has been given the lead role in negotiating. And that is how we have been able to harmonize that.
Thank you, Francis. We have run out of time, but I'd like to give 1 minute to Ioannis, because you have done a lot of initiatives to promote advocacy for international cooperation in enforcement. In a minute, could you guide us through areas where you see improvements can still be made by a competition agency like yourselves, who have already matured into that level of advocacy? Just a minute,
Thank
please.
you, Johannes. I'll try with 1 minute. As we mentioned before, I think there's a need to build a public authority academic partnership. And I think this could help a lot authorities, not only at the national level, but I would say even at the regional or even international level. And I think the ICN can play a very important role here in order to focus work on areas which are of great interest for everyone. These are global problems to a certain extent, and they will need probably to have global solutions. Therefore, the cooperation between the competition authorities will be key. And if we are basing our analysis of the facts on the same type of tools and methodologies, then the likelihood of converging is going to be higher at the international level. So one area I think we need to focus on in the current moment is global food value chains. Mm-hmm. I think we are, seeing, obviously, witnessing an important, crisis. We have the FAO index that has skyrocketed. We actually know the interdependency that there is, a global interdependence that there is, by having a number of choke points. When these are blocked, actually, that creates a number of problems at the global supply chain. We need actually to focus more on resilience. and not only on price. So these are interesting lessons we got out of the COVID crisis. But I think for the time being, there is not enough work done at the international level in this area. And I think we need probably to, as competition authorities, in cooperation with each other, to push academics to do work in this area. In particular, I would say it's very important also when you introduce the sustainability angle as well. In Europe, we're now rethinking the farm to fork type of strategy. I think all these type of issues will probably come up to a number of other jurisdictions. And definitely this is one area, I think, of cooperation. The second one, I'll be very quick, is the use of new technologies and AI for enforcement. The development of a competition law RegTech, which I think could be very useful for us. And it will keep us up to pace also with the necessary upgrade that we need to do of our enforcement tools in order to deal with the upgrade of the tools of the various companies and businesses we are supposed to monitor. And I think there has been a lot of work recently done. Individually, I would say by competition authorities, they hired data scientists, they started projects, competition law and economic projects. But doing that at the individual level, I think, is not sufficient. We don't always have the resources. It's not about budget, it's also about the people. I mean, there are not so many people out there that are interested to work for competition authorities. And therefore, we need also to convince software engineers to engage a little bit more with our, somehow, side and our concerns. And this can only be done internationally because this is a very international community also that really is moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We have the digital nomads. I mean, software engineers are probably a big part of the digital nomads that we see. So from that perspective, I think we probably need to have cooperative approaches, either at the regional groups like European Competition Network or inter-regional groups, or maybe at the international level. Maybe actually we have somehow been thinking at the Greek authority with a number of our partners to launch a global hackathon for software engineers that are interested in competition, to develop competition tools for the analysis of markets. And I think this is something that could be done. And final thing I would say, it's not just about the public authority academic partnership, but we also need to develop this public authority private partnership, in particular in the context of the transformation that we need to do in the next few years in order to reach the objectives of sustainable development, and in particular the climate change challenge. And there I would say it's important to get the businesses with us. And for this, we have to develop different experimental tools to engage with the businesses, not in a repressive way, but actually in a very proactive way to be agents of change, competition authorities being agents of change, and tools like, for instance, the Sustainability Sandbox that we will be launching at the Greek Competition Authority next month could possibly serve this objective. And I think I have to stop because Andreas is getting nervous.
Yes. Thank you, Ioannis. I was getting nervous as well. But obviously, this panel has so much to say about the use of advocacy for purposes of fostering international cooperation with the view towards effective enforcement. And I think what's left for us is to emphasize that we would send out invitations to all other members of the ICN to share their experiences as part of this guide that we are developing as part of the work program of the AWG. Lastly, I simply want to thank all of you for being very comprehensive in your sharing and also very inspiring insofar as the message from Olha from Ukraine. And I'd invite all of you who are here to give our participants on the panel a round of applause. Thank you. As Andreas had stated earlier and was constantly reminded all throughout, we will have an award ceremony for the competition advocacy contest. And I note that some of you have stayed probably in expectation that you will be awarded this afternoon. So thank you for staying around. Andreas, you have the floor again.
So, ladies Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to start immediately the ICN World Bank Group Advocacy Contest Award ceremony here at the 2022 ICN conference. And in order to handle all this, I welcome Graciela Miralles to the podium, as well as Alessandra Tonazzi, who have been doing this already for a long time. Just to mention, this is already the 8th edition of the advocacy contest, carried out jointly by the World Bank and by the ICN. I have to thank many people for that, because this is a lot of investment. I know that. So my special thanks go to the Italian Competition Authority leading this context, and of course to the World Bank. Advocacy was also always a priority of the ICN. In fact, we started with advocacy when we started the ICN, with advocacy and mergers. That was our key priority at the very beginning. During the pandemic, we have seen how the world has suffered. So the theme of this year's contest is related to the role of competition in shaping the economic recovery in a post-pandemic world. So again, many thanks to those who organized it, the World Bank, the co-chairs of the Advocacy Working Group, the Italian Competition Authority, all the NGAs involved. I know that Eleanor Fox and Mariana Tavares also invest a lot on this. It's not easy to pick the right issues and the right advocacy projects. I'm extremely sad that I know already that we are not given an award this year, and you know how much I would like to have one, but we're not in the competition, to be frank, so it's excluded that we get an award. But all of you should stay. Maybe you are among the winners, so you have the floor.
Thank you, Andreas. I'll make it very short because I think our audience is looking forward to a break before the dinner. I'm Alessandra Tonazzi, Director of International of the Italian Competition Authority. I must say that the authority keeps doing this coordination work for the advocacy contest with great pleasure. I remember the first time, Andrés, that we discussed it. It was in Marrakesh in 2014 when we thought, well, the World Bank Group approached us and asked us to do this joint project, and it was the first time that the ICN was engaging in a joint project, and we thought it was a great idea to do something a bit different, also to give an opportunity to agencies that maybe are a bit less in the spotlight for their cases, to give also to share their experience and to be rewarded for their experience. And so we get these stories, and I think Graciela will say how many we got through the years, which is also a wonderful material for the advocacy working group to choose topics and to advance work. So without taking too much time, I would like to open the award ceremony, and I would like to thank also the Advocacy Working Group co-chairs for being part of this. To you, Graciela.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alessandra. Since we started the competition advocacy contest back in 2014, we have received, and now I will give the number, more than 250 stories. This is a big number that confirms that competition advocacy is key to support pro-competition policy reform, create a culture of competition, and of course, complement competition enforcement. These stories feature successful initiatives to embed competition in sector regulation, in digital markets, in public procurement, to foster competitive neutrality, among many other things. And they span across more than 50 markets within 20 sectors, so a lot of numbers here, yes, that include energy, finance, transport, ICT, you name it, and many others. So from the World Bank, we want to thank you all for your generosity in sharing these stories with us and making the ICN World Bank Group Competition Advocacy Contest a success throughout the years. And of course, we look forward to many more years to come. And now let's celebrate this year's awarded stories. Without further ado, let's start with category number 1. Category number 1 recognizes the work on mitigating the risks of increased concentration and state participation in markets. And the winner is the Spanish National Markets and Competition Commission, CNMC. The CNMC developed a set of recommendations for policymakers to enhance the quality of public interventions in markets. These recommendations highlighted the relevance of ex-ante and ex-post evaluation of these interventions at a time when substantial public funding was being disbursed to promote recovery in light of COVID. To accept the award on behalf of the CNMC, please welcome to the podium Mr. Joaquín López Vallés, Director of the Advocacy Department of the CNMC. Well, category number 2 features the topic spreading the benefits of the digital economy. The winner of this category is we actually have a winner and an honorable mention. I want everybody to know. The winner of the category is the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. Singapore's story is an example of successful cooperation between competition authorities and other agencies. The Singaporean agencies jointly published a discussion paper on data portability, established a joint protocol for determining the lead agency in case of overlap, and even conducted a joint inquiry into an actual case. To accept the award on behalf of the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, please welcome to the podium Mr. Lok Shu Meng, Assistant Chief Executive, Legal Enforcement and Consumer Protection. And the honorable mention of this category goes to the Federal Economic Competition Commission of Mexico, COFECE. COFECE initiative aimed at increasing consumer certainty in digital markets by launching a digital strategy to provide guidance on merger control and anti-competitive practices involving digital players. A key aspect of this strategy was the creation of a digital markets unit in charge, among other things, of cooperation with other agencies, notably on data and consumer protection. To accept the award on behalf of COFECE, please welcome to the podium Mrs. Brenda Hernandez, Acting Chairwoman of COFECE.
And now to category 3, engaging through results, successful experiences in planning, implementing, and monitoring advocacy strategies in times of crisis. Here we have 3 awards, 1 winner and 2 honorable mentions. So the winner is Superintendencia de Industria y de Comercio. The Superintendencia carried out an ex-post assessment of the effectiveness of its advocacy initiatives in the past 3 years. Building on this evaluation, it set up a new advocacy strategy, which included, among other things, a new artificial intelligence powered tool, Inspector, to detect regulations potentially impacting competition. So I call to take the prize Mr. Andrés Barreto González, Superintendent of the Industry of Commerce. The first honorable mention goes to the Administrative Council for Economic Defense of Brazil, CAGE. CAGE's initiative aimed at avoiding price controls response to high prices and shortages in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. And CAGE created a competition advocacy unit to monitor emergency legislation and provided opinions on how more competition would foster recovery. The publication of these opinions was key to build support among stakeholders for more competitive responses to the COVID crisis. So to accept the awards, I call Mr. Alexandre Cordeiro Macedo, Presidente. And finally, we are at the end. The second honorable mention goes to the Egyptian Competition Authority for an initiative to foster competition in public procurement during the COVID crisis. The agency launched an advocacy initiative based on 3 pillars: raising awareness among government officials, greater cooperation with the Public Procurement Agency, and stronger enforcement through the use of intelligence tools for detection. So to accept the awards on behalf of the agency, I call Mr. Mahmoud Momtaz, Chairman of the Egyptian Competition Authority. Yes, there is a collective picture, and I think we would also like to call Eleanor Fox, who is one of the judges and doing a lot of work on the award, to take a picture with us.